Hello, this is Brooke GINTY, the host of Voxipop's Community Town Hall, and today it is my immeasurable pleasure to introduce our guest, U.S. Representative Chrissy Houlahan of the 6th Congressional District. Representative Houlahan joins us today to discuss her personal commitments that she made in a June 1 op-ed that she wrote and entitled Listen, Learn, Lead, that she drafted to respond to the death of George Floyd. In her op-ed, she acknowledged the pandemic we are all living in, not COVID-19, which is one too, but she acknowledged the pandemic of systematic racism in America. Since that time, Representative Houlahan has already followed through on that commitment and joined 230 of her fellow Democrats in Congress as a co-sponsor of the Justice in Policing Reform Act of 2020. Additionally, Representative Houlahan has been at the forefront of responding to COVID-19 on behalf of all Pennsylvanians, fighting for small business owners and all those affected by the pandemic. So please welcome Representative Houlahan.
Hi, thank you so much for having me today.
I know you are so busy, and I'm sure you are run ragged, so I really do appreciate you taking the time for us here at Voxipop. I'm going to start with a little bit of your op-ed, which I thought was just incredibly insightful, and I want those of the individuals who've not read it yet to, number one, go read it, and then number two, hear one of the couple of the paragraphs. So I'm going to start, and it says, the force that binds us, our humanity, calls on the U.S. to mourn the deaths of Chester County's own Bianca Robertson and George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery, and so many others. Those responsible must be held accountable, and I recognize the unique privilege of my position in Congress to be part of that solution and necessary reform. So I must recommit myself to using the tools of my office to make real progress on the policies that underpin structural racism, housing and unemployment discrimination, educational inequity, criminal justice reform, for example. I must listen more, I must learn more, I must lead more. I must devote and dedicate my team specifically to these issues more. I must create more spaces to have conversations publicly more. To this, I personally commit. So part of your creed was a promise to listen more and to have hard conversations. Since writing the op-ed, have you been able to start those conversations with your constituents here in the 6th District? And if so, tell a little bit about what you've learned from those conversations.
Sure, and yes, we have had the beginnings of those conversations, and many that I hope continue on into the unforeseeable future. I think one of my most favorite conversations that I was able to have was with Reverend Kyle Boyer, and he is the head of the NAACP in our community in Westchester, and we had a really honest conversation, and we are in the process of putting that together as an essay for us to share with our community, where, I asked him questions, he asked me questions. We had those uncomfortable conversations. Something that he has taught me that I hope to bring forward to you all today is that we really need to make sure that we're naming what we're talking about, and that is systemic racism. And we need to name the fact that there is a problem with police brutality. We need to name the victims because they deserve to have their names heard and held in our hearts. We also, however, and this goes to what portion of the op-ed or the conversation you shared of my essay, we need to recognize that it's a systemic issue that has as its roots hundreds and hundreds of years of oppression and education inequities, environmental inequities, home and housing inequities, healthcare inequities are all also underpinning all of these issues. And we need to make sure that we, as elected officials, have those hard conversations, and we here in our communities have those hard conversations. And one thing I would encourage people to do is understand that you don't have to be an activist with a big A to make a difference in this. You can be self-reflecting. You can be somebody who shares those conversations in smaller groups to be able to make a difference as well.
I think we've heard that topic, uncomfortable conversations, and it's true. You have to feel okay to even say the wrong things in order to get past it. So, and Reverend Boyer is an incredible speaker for that community. So I'm sure your conversations are going to help many, many people.
It is okay to feel uncomfortable. It is okay to make mistakes. That's what's important about beginning the conversations. We can't make change unless we feel a little uncomfortable.
Absolutely. And one of the things that you have done recently is that you've been a co-sponsor for the Justice and Policing Reform Act of 2020, which talks about one of those tenets which you raised, which is justice and policing. So it's brand new, so if you could do me a favor and just do a quick rundown of the central tenets of the Justice and Policing Reform Act for our viewers.
Sure. And so this act is focused exactly on what it sounds like, justice and policing. So it doesn't touch on some of those other areas that we were talking about that systemic racism ought to also address. This piece of legislation addresses no-knock warrants for drug cases and stops them. It ends qualified immunity for police. It combats racial profiling explicitly. It mandates, importantly, data collection so that we have body cams and dashboard cams, and that we know who and why people are being stopped and for what purpose. It also establishes standards for policing that are attached to federal funding as well. So this is a comprehensive package, as you mentioned, that's sponsored by over 200 Democrats in Congress. We will probably be taking a vote on it this Thursday evening.
Yeah, that was my next question. I know at the same time that the Democratic-sponsored bill, piece of legislation was passed, but there was also a counter Republican legislation that is entitled, so similar, Justice Act. Can you, what are the essential differences between the Justice and Policing Act and the Justice Act?
Sure, and I don't know what age people are who are watching this program, but I'm of a certain age that I watched something called Schoolhouse Rock. It was kind of a television commercial of sorts that educated us on how a bill is born and how it becomes a law. And the way that that happens, independent of what the bill or law is about, is it starts either in the House or in the Senate or in both. In this case, in the police reform area, it has started in both. And each House or Senate works to put forward their best version of what it is that they'd like to see put forward into law. So this week, you'll see the House, which is where I serve, vote on its package, and sometime soon I would anticipate that the Senate would vote on theirs if they haven't yet already. And then they would go to conference. They would go together. Representatives from both House and Senate would come together to try and find the common ground, to try and put something forward that they can bring back to the House or the Senate, and then bring forward in a unified way for the president's signature. What we've seen on the House and Senate is that they are different. They cover many of the same areas, but the Senate version doesn't tend to be as meaty and hefty. It doesn't have as many teeth to it. And one of the things I'm committed to as a pragmatic person of reform is that I really want, as our representative, to make sure that I'm voting as much as possible on things that will actually do something, and not things that will research things more or think about them more or make value statements. And so in a very broad sweeping way, the difference between the two bills is that the House version is more prescriptive. It has actual teeth, and the Senate version tends to be more broad sweeping and not necessarily something that will have actual actions associated with it. And before we leave this question, we have heard from both the Senate and the House and our president that all are open for these ideas, and that is not always the case, as you might remember in your Schoolhouse Rock. So we have an opportunity here to make sure that we create law, and that's what the imperative is that the people have asked us to do.
I know a lot of this legislation has been on the floor of the House or been raised by the House before. Similar here in Pennsylvania, Representative Dan Williams, and the Legislative Black Caucus, just held the floor to talk about different legislation there. So I'm glad that it's being picked up again. And I did hear, I think you've addressed it, but I heard that President Trump said that he would veto the Congress-sponsored one. So I'm hoping that, like you said, both sides can come together and put some actual teeth into this one.
And this is where we need to be civically engaged. Part of the conversation is we as citizens already have shown with our feet and with our signs and with marching and a variety of other different ways that we have an appetite for change, and we want our legislature, whether it's state, local, or federal, to do something. So yes, the president may have indicated that he will veto this version, but please, if you are interested in reform in this area, call your representatives, call your senators, call the president, call your local state electeds as well, to let them know that this is important to you.
I think that's a great bit of advice, because sometimes, especially when we talk about systematic racism, it feels so big. We don't know how to handle it or how to approach it. So calling your representatives is an incredible, insightful that we all need to be doing beyond the feet on the ground, for sure.
Absolutely.
And speaking of feet on the ground, I know that following the death of George Floyd and the weeks of Black Lives Matter, actually here in the district, you actually went to a student-led Black Lives Matter protest. And then you joined, as you mentioned, Reverend Kyle Boyer, as well as Michelle Roberson, Lillian DeBaptiste, Mayor Diane Hernan, Chief James Moorhead, and Sheriff Freda Maddox on the steps of the courthouse for a protest there. I know that there was nearly 8,000 participants, which was massive, so I'm sure that was a moment for you. Here in Phoenixville, we had 7 young leaders lead what we called a police and equity protest, and it happened the day after on June 5th. I was able to sit down with those 7 leaders within our community, and I wanted to share a brief clip with you of one of our little leaders within the community, so if you could take a look. What's your experience after the protest? What do you guys think as you reflect back on it?
I definitely thought it was pretty amazing, just because for one, I wasn't expecting it. For two, it really just started with a flyer on social media and somehow it spread throughout the whole town. And after, I think a lot of people really are starting to open their eyes, and a lot of people that I didn't even know, like more Caucasian people, friends that I had, I didn't know, cared so much about what was happening, and it just felt so good to see people out there. I saw tears in people's eyes, and I think now it really shows like change could come. It is, people are really starting to hear what we're saying, and people are really starting to open their eyes up and change the person they are in order so we can change as a whole, which I think was really good to see. And I thought it was just really cool to like Google my name and see stuff pop up, to be honest.
I love that last bit too. So before you became a U.S. representative, I know that you were a former 11th grade high school teacher in Philadelphia, also a mother. So what advice do you have to the young leaders in Phoenixville and throughout your community and throughout the United States?
So I'm a mom to now grown girls, and Miss Garner's mom and dad and family should be enormously proud of the work that she and so many other young people have done on behalf of our community. It really shows you just how powerful your voice is, no matter what your age is. It's definitely how I raised my kids, to know that they had a voice and that they could affect change. Even if they're not old enough to vote, you can see that this cohort, this group of folks, were able to instigate hope and change. And what we saw, I was really overwhelmed by the fact that people were marching all the way from Wayne all the way up until Paoli. And it was not a small crowd. It was blocks and blocks and blocks long, and very, very, as she mentioned, kind of remarkable in its diversity. And as she also mentioned, it's important that we begin those conversations with each other, and that she found them rewarding. And I have found the last several weeks hopeful in many ways, that we are able to begin to have conversations that a few weeks ago we would not maybe have been comfortable in having in our community. We are now at least trying to have those conversations. So what I want to send a message to the young folks in our community is keep going, keep advocating, keep being engaged civically, and if you're able to, make sure that you register to vote and that you vote.
Oh, don't worry, I gave them the vote speech. I said, do you know how your superintendent is placed, and do you know how your board members can place? So I already demanded that the 18-year-olds vote, and those who cannot at least use all their youthful energy to help us along the way. So in addition to the legislation that I know has been on the House floor nationally and locally here in Pennsylvania, there has been a conversation around the topic of defunding police or reallocating resources. And since the protests began and the marches began, I just want to read over highlight a couple things that have happened. First, we had in Minneapolis, where George Floyd was killed, the city council voted to defund the police department and are looking to replace it with a new department that they're entitling focused on cultivating public safety. This week in the news, we had the New York City Council pass legislation which was aimed at overhauling the entire New York Police Department, which before the mayor had said that he would never have signed, but now he's open to that. And just last week, the San Laredo City Council in California became one of the first municipalities to actually reallocate $1.7 million from its city's police departments to social services in its community. So my question is there any sort of pending legislation at the national level that would address either defunding police departments or specifically reallocating funding that has been earmarked to police departments? Or what is going on nationally?
Sure. And Karen Bass, Representative Karen Bass, is the head of the Congressional Black Caucus, and she is the author of the bill that we will be voting on Thursday. And she's done a really nice job of articulating what the federal government's position is and role is on this, which is to say that, listen, we recognize that systemic racism is real. We recognize there is something that can and should be done about police brutality, as an example. But we also recognize that we need to make sure that all of the ways that we address systemic racism are being thought of. And as I have done in my past, been very involved in education, particularly urban education. That's one way, making sure that we have appropriate, affordable, accessible housing, a living wage for people, good health care for people, mental health issues. All of those things are part of the thing that mixes into, how people collide with each other in our society. So absolutely, those parts of our society should be funded more fully, because those are the places where we can stop problems before they happen. But those conversations, as you indicated in your outline, largely are happening at the local and state level, and that's the appropriate place for them to be having them, because they're personal and specific to the place that they are happening in terms of where the funding should go.
Right, and I know that, and thank you for that answer. I know that defunding was not addressed in the Justice Reform Act, so that's a good reason to let our viewers know where it's happening locally, and also another voting nod there.
Yes.
Now let me, I'll get them in where I can. Now let me switch gears to the other pandemic that is affecting our nation, which is COVID-19. I know that you have been an integral part of the ongoing conversation with your constituents and small business owners throughout this crisis. I know you've held over 22 town halls, which is unprecedented. Can you share with me the work that your office is doing, and where can our constituents go to sort of get guidance and help from COVID-19?
Sure, and thanks for addressing this other pandemic that's happening at the same time, because we are certainly not out of the woods when it comes to COVID. And I, before joining Congress, and in addition to being an educator, was primarily an entrepreneur. So in our community, I spent a lot of time building and growing small businesses, a lot like the ones that are in peril right now. And so it's definitely been a huge challenge from a federal perspective to make sure we're being as responsible and rapid with our response as possible. And so some of the things that we have put forward that we have talked about in our town halls have to do with the CARES Act, which is an act that talked not only about small businesses and our response to that, but also making sure that our frontliners were receiving proper PPE and proper compensation to make sure that we were properly researching and finding the cure for this and treatments for this disease. And so this has been, over the last almost 6 months at this point in time, front and center of our conversation. We have, as you mentioned, had a lot of outreach to people. We've also done some really innovative stuff with our organization itself. We've reoriented ourselves to align more appropriately with the pandemic, and we've stood up some task forces, that's hard to say the plural of, which are for small business response, are for individual unemployment response, are for rebate response, et cetera. So if you have questions for our organization, you are welcome, and we would be very delighted to help you with those. Our website is houlahan.house.gov. My last name is spelled Houlahan, which is a little bit less traditional, .house.gov. So if you go to that website and then you click at the very top, you'll see a banner, and that banner will have several different red buttons on it that go to our task force people, the people who are in charge of small business, the people who are in charge of unemployment, the people who are in charge of response for rebates, as an example. You can also email us at PA06, which is the district that that I represent, which is Chester County in the lower part of Berks County, PA06.smallbusiness@mail.house.gov. So that's another place that you can go. I actually just came from a Zoom hearing with small business. I'm privileged enough in Congress to also sit on the small business committee itself. And we will be working on phase 4 or package 4 in the next week or so to further address how to make sure we get every last drop of what it is that we're trying to accomplish with our resources, our federal resources, to the people who need them the most. So that's what I'm working on right here in Washington.
This has been an ever-changing landscape. I'm a small business owner as well, and the amount of information that comes out and then changes and then comes out and changes. So being part of that ongoing process, thank you for that.
One thing I'd love to add to that is you're right.
Yeah.
We've never done anything like this before. This is a monumental lift on the part of so many people. And one of the things I'm trying to accomplish here in Congress is what I'm kind of loosely calling a never again agenda, which basically says, I don't ever want to see this happen to our nation again. Pandemic should never happen again. But if it does, I want to make sure that we're prepared for the next pandemic or the next surge of COVID-19. I want to make sure programs like the PPP program are so surgically refined that we can roll them back out again without quite as much effort and without quite as much broad, brushing. And it's really important that we learn the lessons, unfortunately, in many cases, the hard way, so that we can make sure that we never again have to go through this as a population.
These are incredible times that we find ourselves in, to the middle of 2 pandemics with so much to do. I always give every guest of mine a one last thing. So essentially anything that we didn't talk about or any kind of final statement you'd like to send to your viewers and your constituents. You've got the floor.
Sure. One thing I've always been struck by for the 6th Congressional District, which is just all of Chester County and a lower part of Berks, we are really a pragmatic people, and we're just kind of genuinely all about making sure that we're respectful and that we get things done while respecting each other. And we've seen that all over the place with the pandemic that we're facing of both kinds right now. People are really working together, they're coming together, they're talking to each other, and they're trying to be respectful in both pandemic cases. And I'm very, very grateful to call this part of Pennsylvania home, and I'm very, very grateful to serve this part of Pennsylvania.
Well, we thank you for your service. I know that you've been doing amazing things as a freshman in Congress, as you say. And I also did want to extend a congratulations. I know it was a goal of yours when you first became a U.S. representative to seek that Democracy Award, and you have been nominated as a finalist from the Congressional Management Foundation. So congratulations.
Thank you. I'm very, very proud of my team for that. We'll see if we are successful. Our freshman teams are very, very rarely successful in getting this far, so we're very, very happy to have that as a testament to the hard work done.
Well, it's great. And I do also know you've got a sign outside of your office, which I thought was amazing, that said this office belongs to every person in Pennsylvania.
To the people of the Pennsylvania 6th, exactly.
Yeah.
Not my office, it's our office, exactly.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much for all that you're doing, Representative Houlahan. I'm proud to be one of your constituents, and we will let you go. I know you've got many things to do, so thank you so much for being with us today.
I appreciate it. You guys be safe, and I'll see you back home.
All right.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. All right. This is Brooke GINTY with Voxipop's Community Town Hall. As always, this is a video on demand, and I urge you to share it with your friends and family. Also, make sure that everyone knows how to reach out to Representative Houlahan. She has been easy to talk to. I know that her team is working tirelessly. So if you have questions, no matter what they are, please contact Representative Houlahan's office. We will provide that information for you as well. As always, thank you so much for joining us. I hope you're safe and well, and happy summer. Have a great day.